You're watching A News. I'm Bakhtiar Sanova, and let's see the top stories. President Donald Trump says Washington is ending talks with Tehran as the dispute over Hormuz continues. Syria confirms several tons of nuclear material is found in the country after a visit by UN inspectors. And a Meta's trial begins. The Facebook owner denies claims that it addicted children to its platforms. President Donald Trump says Washington is ending talks with Tehran as the dispute over control of the Strait of Hormuz continues. Donald Trump says that no conversations are taking place and that the U.S. naval blockade of the strait remains in full force. Iran says the United States is now begging to negotiate on Tehran's terms.
U.S. President Donald Trump says no talks were taking place with Iran and insisted the Strait of Hormuz was open, contradicting Iran's assertion that it remained shut. Shipping through the strait slowed, according to data on Wednesday, as most ship owners avoided the key waterway. Just 6 commodity vessels crossed the strait on Tuesday, down from 9 the previous day. The United States says it's patrolling the strait with naval forces. Shipping data from KPILA shows that more than 80% of vessels using the waterway over the past 2 weeks have taken the Omani route, which Tehran strongly opposes. Iran has attacked dozens of ships attempting to use that route. The United Arab Emirates Defense Ministry said on Tuesday that it had detected 2 ballistic missiles launched from Iran. It's the first such incident reported since a 4th of May strike on the Fujairah port. In a statement later, the ministry said the missiles targeted maritime traffic that fell into the sea. However, Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson Esmail Baghai rejected the statement by the UAE, describing it as baseless. U.S. officials say oil shipments through and around the strait reached about 15 million barrels per day last week, compared with a pre-war average of 20 million. Trump has claimed total control of the waterway, but continued Iranian attacks and lower oil flows raise questions over that assertion. Iranian officials have mocked Trump's claim, saying Washington has failed to reopen the strait after he described it as new U.S. territory.
Iran's chief negotiator says that Tehran is standing firm on its position that the U.S. naval blockade must be lifted ahead of any deal. Turash Shirelilo has the latest from Tehran.
Iran's parliament speaker says Tehran will keep the Strait of Hormuz closed to maritime traffic until the United States fulfills commitments outlined in a memorandum of understanding reached during ceasefire talks in Islamabad in June. Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who led Iran's delegation in the U.S.-Iran negotiations in Pakistan, told Parliament that the strategic waterway would remain closed unless Washington unfreezes Iranian assets and lifts restrictions on Iranian oil exports, which Tehran says were part of the interim agreement that expired on Monday. In a post on X, Ghalibaf also rejected the possibility of Iran making additional concessions under U.S. pressure. He said recent comments by U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Secretary of War Pete Hegseth about imposing conditions on Iran were not consistent with the terms agreed in Islamabad. The comments come amid statements from Iranian civilian and military officials indicating that Tehran could shift from a defensive to a more offensive military posture if what it describes as a naval blockade of its southern ports in the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman is not lifted. Turash Shirelilo from Tehran for A News.
Meanwhile, Iran has warned Gulf states against helping the U.S. military amid rising regional tensions. Iran's chief of staff says U.S. military activity at bases across the region is being closely watched. In a social media post on X, Major General Ali Abdullahi pointed to a large number of American aircraft, particularly refueling tankers, that had been spotted. Abdullahi said their presence was unlikely without the knowledge of host countries. He has warned that any assistance or facilitation for the U.S. military will be considered participation alongside American forces. To discuss the latest developments, the risks of a further escalation over the Strait of Hormuz and the impact on global energy markets, we're joined by Dr. Reza Talebi, author and journalist, speaking to us from Leipzig, Germany. Dr. Talebi, thank you for making time to join us on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Dr. Talebi, President Donald Trump says there are currently no talks with Iran. Does this mean diplomacy has effectively collapsed, or could this simply be a negotiating tactic by Washington?
This is less about the total collapse or diplomacy and more about the classic maximum pressure tactic. In negotiation strategy, signaling that you are willing to walk away is designed to force the other side to return under weaker conditions. While former public talks may be paused, back-channel diplomacy through regional intermediaries remains active. So, this is a tactical delay rather than a structural end of diplomacy.
So Iran says the Strait of Hormuz will not reopen unless its demands are addressed. What would it take to actually restore freedom of navigation through the strait?
Restoring freedom of navigation requires a mutual security deal. First, economic bottlenecks must be addressed, such as lifting the blockades on ports and easing financial restriction. And second, on the ground, maritime routes need to be cleared of naval mines and risk level lowered. And the shipping companies will not return based on political promise alone. They need concrete security guarantees and manageable insurance costs.
Dr. Talebi, how serious is the economic pressure created by the disruption in Hormuz? And how high could oil prices go if the situation continues?
The pressure, is severe because about 20% of global oil and liquefied natural gas passes through Hormuz. Prolonged disruption creates a massive supply shock, and if the standoff continues, crude oil prices could easily pass on $100 per barrel and potentially reach 120, maybe to $150 in a worst case scenario. This would trigger global inflation and slow down world economic growth.
Dr. Talebi, the United Arab Emirates has suspended all trade and financial transactions with Iran. How significant is this decision for the Iranian economy, given the UAE's importance as a commercial and financial hub for Tehran?
This is a major economic blow. Abu Dhabi has long acted as a vital commercial hub for Iran, serving as a gateway for exports, currency exchange, and trade financing. But cutting off these official financial links restricts Iran access to international currency markets, increased trading costs, and adds heavy pressure to Iran's internal economy.
But Iran denies launching the two ballistic missiles reported by the UAE. How dangerous is the possibility of further incidents involving Gulf states, even if Tehran denies responsibility?
Unclaimed or uncertain attacks are dangerous because they dramatically increase the risk of miscalculation. Even when responsibility is denied, regional military forces operate on high alert. This heightens the chance of accidental military engagement or unintended escalation, and making it extremely difficult for regional state to remain neutral.
Dr. Talabi, we're now hearing reports that Iran has considered targeting U.S. military facilities in Europe if the conflict escalates. How credible and strategically significant is this a threat?
While Iran possesses ballistic capabilities that can reach part of the southeastern Europe, carrying out such an attack carries extreme strategic risks. Striking target in Europe would instantly expand the confrontation from regional Gulf crisis into an international conflict. And therefore, this threat functions primarily as a psychological deterrent rather than an immediate operational plan.
So, from an energy perspective, are we approaching a point where prolonged disruption in the Strait of Hormuz could seriously affect global inflation, shipping costs, and economic growth?
I'm not energy expert, but yes, we are approaching that critical tipping point. Rising war risk, insurance premiums for shipping, combined with higher energy and transport costs, threatening to reignite global inflation, and central banks would be forced to keep interest rates high, which directly reduce consumer spending and rises the risk of global stagflation.
Dr. Reza Talabi, thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your analysis and expertise on this rapidly evolving situation. We appreciate your time and your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Best
U.S. President Donald Trump has delayed the planned 50% tariff regime on Canadian imports for 3 days, giving the two sides more time to finalize a trade deal. The pause comes after Donald Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke twice by phone over the past 2 days. Carney says there is still important work to be done, despite substantial progress being made. It's reported that the two countries traded around $880 billion in goods and services last year. Meta is facing trial in the United States over allegations that its products have caused harm to children. A coalition of 29 U.S. states has accused the social media giant of violating consumer protection laws. The case looks set to be the biggest legal test yet of social media's impact on youngsters. Ira Spitzer reports from California.
This landmark trial has now kicked off at this courtroom in Oakland, California, and we heard opening arguments both from this consortium of U.S. states as well as from attorneys for Meta. And the main issue here, the focus of the state's argument, is that they say that the way that Meta designed its platforms, Facebook and Instagram, was done to hook children, to make children and teens addicted to these platforms, and that the company continued to do this despite knowing about the harms that its platforms were doing to young users. So California's Deputy Attorney General laying out some pretty strong accusations in her opening remarks. And we also, of course, heard from Meta's lawyers, and they said that the state's claims here are unsubstantiated and pointed to industry-wide challenges such as age verification, and said that they're in essence being unfairly singled out. But this is a case with major implications. The states are asking for damages of up to $200 billion. That would be equal to several years of Meta's profits. The company is worth more than $1 trillion, but we've really seen a groundswell of activity in the last couple of years here in the U.S. with potential legal liability for Meta over this alleged harm to younger users. We've seen judgments against Meta in the past, although the company has said it plans to appeal those verdicts. But certainly the stakes here are incredibly high This is really seen as the tip of the iceberg, with thousands of similar lawsuits being prepared around the U.S. And again, really focusing on the design of the products and what Meta knew and when they knew it about what these products might have been doing to younger users. So we're expecting to hear from Meta executives, including Meta's CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, as well as Instagram CEO, Adam Mosseri, over the next 6 to 8 weeks. That's about how long this trial is expected to last. And again, with Meta, this could not only result in potential monetary damages, but also could be just increase the pressure on the company and on U.S. lawmakers and regulators to potentially take more action as far as regulating the alleged effects on younger users. Ira Spitzer for A News in Oakland, California.
Several Ukrainian cities have come under overnight Russian drone strikes, with casualties reported in Kherson and Zaporizhia. Russia, meanwhile, says its air defenses intercepted a large number of Ukrainian drones across multiple regions.
4 people were killed and 4 others injured after a Russian drone struck a fixed-route minibus in Kherson. That's according to Ukrainian authorities. Kherson governor said the injured passengers were all women and were taken to hospital. Ukrainian prosecutors say they've opened a war crimes investigation into the attack. Ukraine's Air Force said Russia launched 2 Iskander-M ballistic missiles and 65 drones overnight, including Shahed and other types of UAVs. Ukrainian forces said they destroyed or jammed 58 aerial targets. Separately, Russian drone strikes on the Ukrainian city of Zaporizhia killed 1 person and injured 7 others overnight, according to Ukraine's State Emergency Service. The strike sparked a fire on the 2nd floor of a hostel, where rescuers recovered 1 body from the rubble. A furniture store was also set ablaze, while a nearby apartment building sustained damage, including shattered windows and a damaged roof. Meanwhile, Russian authorities reported hundreds of Ukrainian drones were intercepted overnight across several regions. Drone activity was also reported near Dzержinsk, where local media said explosions and smoke were seen near the Sverdlov explosives plant. Russia's defense ministry also said a cargo vessel carrying military supplies was struck in the Black Sea near Odessa.
Ukraine's ousted defense minister is calling for presidential elections despite the ongoing war. Mikhailo Fedorov says Ukraine is facing a governance crisis, with elections suspended under martial law since Russia's full-scale invasion 4 years ago.
Ukraine's recently dismissed former defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, has called for a wartime presidential election in the most direct political challenge to Volodymyr Zelensky. It's despite elections being suspended in the country since martial law was imposed at the start of the full-scale invasion by Russia in 2022. He said that Ukraine had to restore a full democratic process even amid a prolonged war, in a video address released online late Tuesday evening.
Democracy cannot be held hostage by Russia. We must find a lawful, safe and realistic mechanism that would allow Ukraine to restore a fully functioning democratic process, even under conditions of a long war. We are facing a systemic governance crisis. The old system lives by its own rules too often. It protects itself, fears change, makes decisions slowly, and may punish the initiative while rewarding loyalty.
Hours earlier, Zelensky confirmed he had asked Parliament to confirm Yevhen Kamara as the new defense minister, effectively closing the door on a Fedorov comeback. Last month, Fedorov was unexpectedly fired from his role, just 6 months after his appointment. He was suddenly dropped by Zelensky in a government reshuffle after a falling out with military commander General Alexander Syrsky. Street protests followed, leading to the sacking of Syrsky, but there was no sign Fedorov would be reinstated. Fedorov's call is the first such demand by a major Ukrainian political figure since the war began. The president's office has yet to issue a statement on Fedorov's latest remarks. Zelensky's term ended in May 2024, but the country has postponed its presidential election due to continuing martial law.
Meanwhile, Fedorov's call for elections has drawn supporters out onto the streets of Kiev, backing the idea. However, they raise concerns about holding a presidential vote during a war.
Protesters calling for elections in Ukraine are confronting a fundamental question. How can a vote be organized while the war continues? At a rally in central Kiev, demonstrators backed former defense minister Mikhailo Fedorov's call for elections, but many also questioned whether they could realistically be held.
I don't see a way to hold elections. I'd like to, but I don't see a way. Anything is possible here. I'd like to believe it will happen, because we don't know when the war will end, and our government is losing touch with reality, and we need to renew the government. Unfortunately, we can't do without it.
Fedorov, removed as defense minister in July, has argued that the country is facing a crisis of governance and needs elections. Ukrainian law prohibits them under martial law. A displaced resident from Zaporizhzhia said holding a vote in areas close to the front line would be particularly difficult.
I support Fedorov's statement, but I don't think there will be an election. I think Volodymyr Zelensky should simply step down.
Fedorov was once a close ally of Zelensky and is now a potential political rival. But he has not said whether he would run for office. On Wednesday, Ukraine's parliament approved the appointment of Yevgeny Kamara as defense minister. Zelensky had nominated Kamara, whom he previously appointed as acting minister, following Fedorov's removal last month.
Figures just out from Russia's central bank show that billions of rubles are being withdrawn by savers every month amid concerns over the rising cost of the war in Ukraine. 5 of Russia's 7 largest banks have seen reserves fall. Gazprom Bank saw just under 3 billion rubles or $3.7 billion withdrawn between March and July, equivalent to almost 11% of its entire retail deposit base. A similar figure was withdrawn from the Russian banking system as a whole in first half of August. Fears that the government could freeze accounts or even nationalize private deposits to fund its war effort has shaken the confidence of investors. Meanwhile, slowing economic growth and the increase in Ukrainian drone strikes are taking their toll. Russia's economy grew by just 0.3% in the first half of 2026, according to Kremlin data. And after the break, Syria confirms several tons of nuclear material is found in the country after a visit by UN inspectors. Welcome back, you're watching A News. Several tons of nuclear material has been found at an undisclosed site in Syria, according to the country's foreign ministry. The discovery was made last month after visits by inspectors of the UN Atomic Agency watchdog, the IAEA. Syria's Foreign Minister Assad al-Shaibani said the material was not considered to be dangerous and would stay in the custody of the Syrian authorities. The watchdog's chief Rafael Grossi said the agency was able to access the site after being notified by the Syrian government. Syria is not known to hold operational stockpiles of nuclear material for weapons use, but Israel bombed a suspected Syrian nuclear reactor in 2007 in the country's eastern province of Deir al-Zor. Syria's Foreign Minister Assad al-Shaibani is due in Islamabad today for a 2-day visit. It will be the first visit by a Syrian foreign minister since the fall of Bashar al-Assad. Mariam Zia reports from Islamabad.
Syria's new leadership is looking to deepen ties with Pakistan. Foreign Minister Assad al-Shaibani arrives in Islamabad on Wednesday for a 2-day visit. Al-Shaibani is expected to meet Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar, as well as country's defense and commerce ministers. The talks are expected to focus on defense cooperation, economic ties, and regional security, including developments in Syria and the wider Middle East. The visit will be first by a Syrian foreign minister to Pakistan since Bashar al-Assad was ousted in December 2024. The previous visit by a Syrian foreign minister took place in May 2007. Pakistan and Syria have maintained political and military ties for decades, including military training exchanges. Islamabad also kept its embassy in Damascus open throughout the Syrian conflict and maintained diplomatic representation after Assad's removal. However, the two countries currently lack a formal framework for broad cooperation. The visit comes as Damascus seeks to expand its regional partnerships and Islamabad looks to build on its long-standing ties with Syria amid major political and security changes in the Middle East. Mariam Sia, A News, Islamabad.
Meanwhile, Turkey has strongly condemned an Israeli strike on a military airbase in northwestern Syria, calling it a violation of Syrian sovereignty. The incident early on Tuesday has raised concerns over a wider confrontation involving the three countries at a time when Washington is seeking de-escalation among its partners in the region. Adam Morrow reports from Istanbul.
Turkey has condemned in the strongest possible terms an Israeli attack on the Abu el-Duhur military airbase in northwestern Syria near the Turkish border. In a statement, the Turkish Foreign Ministry said the airstrikes had violated Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity, accusing Israel of staging repeated attacks on Syrian infrastructure and military facilities. Ankara did not say whether Turkish troops had been deployed at the airbase at the time of the attack, which reportedly damaged a runway but didn't cause any casualties. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office said Syria had been on the verge of violating what it described as a security status quo agreed to with Israel by letting Turkish forces deploy at the airbase. The dispute highlights growing tensions between Israel and Turkey in the Syrian theater following the fall of the Bashar al-Assad government in late 2024. Since Assad's departure, Ankara has expanded its political and military cooperation with Syria's new leadership and has been involved in efforts to train and rebuild the country's security forces. The United States has also criticized the Israeli strike on the airbase. Tom Barak, Washington's ambassador to Turkey and its special envoy for Syria, described the attack as unnecessary. He also said the United States was working to set up what he described as a deconfliction mechanism between Turkey, Israel, and Syria. According to Barak, Ankara was not warned in advance about the impending Israeli attack near its southern border. Meanwhile, Syrian Foreign Minister Asad al-Shaibani urged Israel to reconsider its approach towards Syria, saying it was now confronting not only Damascus, but also Syria's allies. This is Adam Morrow for A News in Istanbul, Turkey.
And to discuss this, we are joined by Hamdi Rifai, Government Relations Executive Director for MOS Strategies and Foreign Affairs Analyst, speaking to us from Washington, D.C. Hamdi Rifai, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. Mr. Rifai, Israel says the strike was aimed at preventing a Turkish military deployment. How credible is this explanation, and why Israel fear from a stronger Turkish presence in Syria?
I think that we have to take a step back and understand that Israel's vision for the future is very different from Turkey's and Syria's and most of the world's, in fact, maybe all of the world's. So Israel continues to believe that the proper security paradigm for the Middle East is one rooted in the past that we've already seen fail, which is to have destabilization and weakness in its neighbors. And the vision for the future for most of the rest of the world is a vision consistent with Turkey's, where there's stability, cooperation, and development economically. So with that as a starting point, we see that Israel only sees enemies behind every door. And so when it says that there's a credible security threat, we really have to take that with a little bit of a grain of salt, because we've seen again and again that all of their assessments in recent history have been incorrect and guided by very different ideas and visions that aren't rooted in the facts of what's happening in the Middle East. We're seeing a clash of fact versus fiction, ideas versus what Israel is trying to create, which is enemies. Israel is creating enemies of all of its neighbors, even where there isn't one.
So could the presence of Turkish forces at Syrian military facilities create a direct risk of confrontation between two NATO partners?
I think we know that since the fleeing of Assad, Turkey has played a very responsible role in cooperating with to help rebuild. Turkey was already there in Syria because of the security threats. It's acted in a way to create stability, whereas Israel has done everything to create instability. So when Turkey acts in Syria, if it is creating a risk, it's only because Israel is acting without regard to creating stability and trying to create the instability. So it's actually moving towards the threat, whereas Turkey is trying to avert that threat.
Mr. Rufai, in your view, how far is Ankara prepared to go in supporting President Ahmad al-Shara's government?
So Turkey is not just supporting the al-Shara government. Turkey is supporting stability. And Ahmed al-Shara is the tool to that stability. He's laid out a plan forward for how Syria will develop economically, how it might secure its borders, how it will rebuild its military, how it will provide for its people. So Turkey is willing to go to virtually any length, and Turkey's President Erdogan has made that very clear, to bring that stability, because instability in Syria is instability in Turkey, is instability in the wider region, is instability throughout Europe. So Turkey is willing to do whatever it takes, and it's acted in a very considered way towards that.
So the United States has criticized this strike as an unnecessary escalation and is reportedly working on a deconfliction mechanism. Can Washington realistically prevent an Israel-Turkey confrontation in Syria?
Well, reports are that Israel notified Washington of its intent in advance, and that the United States told Israel, do not bomb. So when we talk about deconfliction, we're seeing a very different Israel than we've seen in the past, because in the past, the U.S. was able to exercise some degree of influence to reduce the severity of Israel's actions, to prevent it from taking actions that were unwise. And I think lately we've seen that Israel is moving in a very different direction from the U.S., which raises the question as to whether the United States continues to have sufficient influence to create deconfliction or to move towards peace with Israel as a partner. And I think the United States is starting to recognize that Turkey is that peace partner, and Israel, it has less influence on it than it previously thought it had.
Mr. Rufai, how difficult will it be for the United States to balance its strategic relationship with Israel, with its growing cooperation with the new Syrian government and Turkey?
So the United States understands that Turkey is a NATO partner.
Yes.
And that creates a big problem for the United States, because really the primary security partner has been, for the United States, NATO, Turkey, and Turkey has influence throughout the region, whereas Israel, there's been a fiction that Israel is America's security partner in the region because it's the only democracy. And I think we've seen that it's not much of a democracy, and that other nations are steadily moving towards democracy, and that by having Israel as a security partner in the Middle East, the the United States is actually hurting itself by continuing that arrangement. So I think it really is less about balance and coming to a realization that Turkey and Israel have very different visions. The United States is slowly arriving at that place. And then we can talk about balance because the United States has to come on board with the facts.
So if Turkey does proceed with a military deployment at Syrian air bases, what options would Israel realistically have, and how dangerous could the consequences be?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
So if Turkey does proceed with a military deployment at Syrian air bases, what options would Israel realistically have, and how dangerous could the consequences be?
So Israel right now is occupying the Golan Heights and has expanded that into further security zones, inching closer and closer towards Damascus, taking towns, disappearing Syrian citizens from Syrian soil, establishing military outposts. But Turkey's presence is for the most part on Turkey's border with Syria. So it's inside of Syria, but close to its border. This airbase that Israel bombed was northwest Syria, very far away from Israel. So I don't think that's a real possibility that Israel would have the capability even to take over an airbase and to occupy that airbase to create some sort of military outpost or otherwise. Nor have we seen any history of Israel conducting its affairs that way, far from its own border. So I don't think that's likely, but I also don't think that's Israel is capable of it.
Hamdi Rafai, thank you very much for this discussion. We truly appreciate your time and insights. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Iceland is heading to a key referendum on whether to restart EU membership talks, a decision that could have wider implications for the bloc's future enlargement. The issue of Iceland's membership has been on hold for over a decade. Anita Sharma has more.
Welcome to This Day in Europe, where a referendum in Iceland could have implications far beyond the small Nordic island. Next week, Icelanders vote on whether to restart negotiations to join the EU, talks Reykjavik abandoned more than a decade ago. Iceland is already closely tied to the bloc through the European Economic Area and the Schengen area, but full membership would take that relationship to the next level. The referendum is not a vote on membership itself. Any eventual deal would require a second referendum, and Brussels is watching closely. EU diplomats tell Reuters that bringing a wealthy, modern economy like Iceland into the bloc could make enlargement more attractive to Europeans wary of admitting less prosperous countries. That could provide a political boost for candidates including Montenegro, Albania, Moldova, and Ukraine. Montenegro hopes to join as early as 2028, and some officials believe its progress alongside Iceland could help overcome resistance to further enlargement. Norway is also watching. Its prime minister recently said Iceland's decision should influence Norwegian attitudes towards the bloc. If Iceland eventually joins, Norway and Liechtenstein would be the only EEA countries remaining outside the bloc. But Icelanders are deeply divided. A Gallup poll this month found 46% support restarting negotiations and 46% oppose it, while a majority still opposes EU membership itself. The debate has been revived by rising living costs and a dramatically different geopolitical landscape, including growing tensions in the Arctic involving both Russia and the US. If Iceland votes yes, negotiations could move quickly. EU Enlargement Commissioner Marta Koss says talks could take just 1 to 2 years, but one major obstacle remains: fishing. Iceland fiercely protects its fishing industry and control over its waters. But with fisheries representing a relatively small part of the EU economy, Koss signaled Brussels may be willing to compromise. Because for the EU, Iceland's vote could mean something bigger, a chance to inject new momentum into the bloc's wider enlargement project. For A News, I'm Anita Sharma in Arnhem, Netherlands.
UK inflation has hit its highest level since March. Rising gas and electricity bills were the main driver, with the annual inflation rate reaching 2.9% in July, presenting a challenge for Prime Minister Andy Burnham, who has pledged to make tackling the cost of living a priority for his government.
UK inflation rose to 2.9% in July, as higher household energy bills added to the pressure on household finances. The Office for National Statistics says the annual rate of inflation increased from a 15-month low of 2.6% in June. The rise was in line with economists' forecasts and marks the first increase in the annual inflation rate since March. A key factor was the cost of gas and electricity, after the household energy price cap increased by 13% at the start of July. The jump in energy prices came as global energy markets faced renewed volatility following the conflict involving Iran. The ONS also pointed to other pressures on household spending. Furniture prices fell by less than usual for this time of year, while clothing prices also saw a smaller decline as retailers offered fewer discounts. There was some relief elsewhere in the data. Prices for raw materials and goods leaving factories rose more slowly in July, helped by lower crude oil and refined petroleum prices. Core inflation, which excludes energy and food prices, also rose slightly more than expected, coming in at 2.6%. The figures are likely to be closely watched by the Bank of England as it considers the outlook for inflation, household finances, and interest rates.
The race to become the next UN Secretary General has another contender, with Ecuadorian diplomat Ivone Baki joining the field. Meanwhile, an informal reader survey has put Costa Rica's Rebecca Greenspan ahead of the other candidates.
Ecuadorian diplomat Ivone Baki has entered the race to become the next United Nations Secretary General, becoming the 8th candidate seeking to succeed Antonio Guterres. Baki, a former Ecuadorian government minister and ambassador to several countries, was nominated by Tonga. She said she wants to bring fresh ideas and make the UN more effective in addressing global conflicts. The next Secretary General will face growing calls for UN reform amid criticism over its bureaucracy and demands for greater efficiency. Baki is the second candidate from Ecuador in the race. Other contenders include former Costa Rican Vice President Rebecca Greenspan, former Chilean President Michelle Bachelet, and former Ecuadorian Foreign Minister Maria Fernanda Espinosa. Guterres is due to step down at the end of the year after 2 5-year terms. The UN Security Council has begun informal polling as part of the selection process, with a second round expected later this week. A Pass Blue, an independent non-profit media organisation covering the United Nations, survey of around 1,500 readers put Greenspan in first place with 32% of the vote. Espinosa followed with 23.4%, while Bachelet received 21.9%. The next Secretary General is expected to take office on January 1st, 2027, following a recommendation by the Security Council and appointment by the General Assembly.
Now we have a short break. Right after the break, we'll look at stories shaping the region. Welcome back. You're watching A News. Russia's ambassador to Azerbaijan has been summoned to the foreign ministry after Baku lodged objections to what it calls provocative, insulting and threatening media statements targeting the country and its people. Officials cited recent broadcasts on Russian TV and radio, including Chistota Ponimania on Sputnik Radio and Spas TV. Baku has urged Moscow to take immediate action. The Russian Foreign Ministry says the comments did not reflect Moscow's official position. It stressed that bilateral relations with Baku should develop in line with the 2022 Declaration on Allied Interaction. Ukraine has thanked Azerbaijan for its assistance to the country's energy sector. Ukraine's Ministry of Energy said Azerbaijan is among the partner countries providing energy equipment to the country. According to the ministry, Ukraine has received energy equipment from several countries since the beginning of 2026. Since March 2022, more than 32,300 tons of energy equipment have been delivered to the country. In a total of 2,542 humanitarian shipments have been sent during this period. More than 28,900 tons of the equipment has already been distributed among different regions of Ukraine. The ministry thanked all partner countries for their support in helping Ukraine keep its energy system running. Uzbekistan is planning to expand its role in Georgia's Black Sea logistics network with a new logistics center in Poti and work on the Anaklia deep sea port. Nini Nikolashvili reports from Tbilisi.
Uzbekistan says it plans to open a logistics center at Georgia's Black Sea port of Poti with an annual capacity of 500,000 tons by 2027. Presidential press secretary Sherzad Asad also said Tashkent would begin practical work on the development of the Anaklia deep sea port. The announcements follow closer contacts between the two countries. In July, Uzbekistan's investment and transport ministers visited Poti and the Anaklia construction site with Georgia's economy minister. Days later, President Shavkat Mirziyoyev's visit to Tbilisi elevated bilateral ties to a strategic partnership with transport connectivity among the priorities. Uzbekistan has also proposed linking the China-Kyrgyzstan-Uzbekistan railway with the Baku-Tbilisi-Kars line, potentially creating another route for Central Asian cargo to Georgia's Black Sea coast. But the two projects are at different stages. The Poti Center has a target opening date, while Anaklia is still being developed. Georgia adopted a state-run landlord model for Anaklia in July after a Chinese-Singaporean consortium withdrew. Terminal tenders are still pending and the first ship is not expected before 2029. Whether Uzbekistan's interest leads to concrete investment or a terminal agreement will show how significant its role in Anaklia will ultimately be. Nini Nikolashvili, Tbilisi, A News.
And this concludes our news update for the hour. Thank you for your time and stay tuned to A News for more updates.